Anshar Seraphim, thank you so much for joining me. Again, it took us a little while to get back on recording something, but we've just had a slightly interesting a little bit of banter. Thanks so much for chatting to me and yeah, joining me on here.
Yeah, it's so wonderful to be back, and I had so much fun the last time because we got to kind of go all over the place a little bit, and it was
Yeah.
it was funny because I was starting to get, being able to talk about my special interest. I kind of got carried away, and I was watching it after and thinking, oh boy, what did I do? Because
Yeah.
we went from talking about trust, and then somehow ended up in Star Trek teleporters, and we were talking about railroad spikes through the brain, and it definitely took a left turn, but I
Yeah.
I had a lot of fun. So I was looking forward to being back.
Cool. Me too. And we did stick to the script in a way because it did kind of stay on topic around trust. I mean, it is a big topic, so we can kind of, go off a little bit.
I guess in that way it was, can we trust our senses? Maybe.
There we go.
We could
Yeah.
we could definitely make that argument that little aside with Carl Sagan and the the
Yes.
transporters and the continuation of consciousness was really talking about our ability to trust our own bias. So I
Yeah.
guess that's important. So I guess yeah, I could say we stayed on topic.
And I mean that was a fascinating bit actually. Just to recap quickly, your theory is that we recreate our consciousness every day, in essence, being a different person in a way, or different consciousness as we bring some of our experiences with us, but in a new light.
Yeah, the way I like to think of it is the it's like a big balloon, like a hot air balloon.
Yeah.
And when it all comes all the way down and the temperature cools down, there's still a pile of cloth there. There's, and whatever little bit of atmosphere is left in there, whether you're dreaming or whatever, but once it fills back up and you become conscious all the way again, I think people get too locked into these binary states of it's either an emergent consciousness or it's not. But every bit of physical material in your body in 8 years is going to be completely different physical material. So obviously there's a little bit more to identity than substance.
Yeah.
So I think that talking about that, and if you think of it as kind of like a deflated hot air balloon, it makes sense why when sometimes there's certain stimulus, or we have dreams, or we have stimulation, or even if you're a coma patient and the right things happen, you'll have these fleeting memories or moments. And I think it's, there's some wind blowing into the hot air balloon, but the fact that it doesn't completely empty, or it's not like snap of your fingers recreated from thin air, I think people have trouble with that concept, and so they don't think of that as an emergent consciousness. But once it's able to perceive its own existence, then it's a consciousness. And and you'll have your memory system will start working if you have that moment in a dream. If you're lucid dreaming and all of a sudden you have a moment where you actually realize that you're dreaming and that you are a thinking conscious being and you're not just letting the wind blow through your hot air balloon, then you will have that moment of realization and have that moment of consciousness and remember it, even though you're happening out of order with the process of storing memories.
Yeah.
And ergo, since you're not doing that on the normal cycle, those memories eventually start to fade away with the process of short-term memory. I think to me that makes sense, that's not, but I think I tell people about this idea of an emergent consciousness, and they just get horrified that this thing that they're thinking is them in the moment is going to be dead tomorrow, is what they're thinking. But if that's the way that it's always been, and every morning we wake up and that hot air balloon fills up again, ready to fly, then that is normal. And it's just
Yeah.
understanding that normal is different. So I don't think that's a good reason to go against the theory. But I like it because it really solves that whole teleporter conundrum. Because if you're just that hot air balloon, then it doesn't really matter what air fills you up in a different place.
Mhm.
And if you're not necessarily the matter that you're made out of, because that's slowly flowing through us, then what you really are is you're a pattern
Mhm.
that's resisting entropy in a temporary system, right? Because we're powered by the sun.
Yeah.
And that that pattern holds itself and kind of flexes in that same way as long as it can. And then through telomere shortening and everything else, it eventually deflates and
Yeah.
goes back into the rest of the balloon that is the universe. And, if that's reality, then if we teleport from one place to another, doesn't matter at all.
Yeah.
We
Well,
probably wouldn't even notice.
well, I find a lot of value in that, and I think there's a lot to add to it. Kind of, um, dream versus wakeness or wakefulness. Where do we go when we dream? Do we visit parallel universes? Are there various versions of us in various states of consciousness? I mean, it's a big topic, isn't it? And there are many possibilities. I
Yeah,
think.
one of the things that fascinated me the most about studying astronomy,
Mm,
because, when you first see a topic, it's very abstract.
mm.
But when you get to the topic of astronomy, and here we go talking about teleporting through space with consciousness again, this is going to be the whole
Yes,
episode
please.
if you watch. So um, I find it really interesting because I don't know, this whole process of the way that we think about things and the way that we position ideas, I think that we mislead our conclusions sometimes because when you look at astronomy and you get this sense of just how big the universe is, just what we're able to see, and you can't really wrap your mind around it until you actually study astronomy. Because even if you just take an introductory class to astronomy, you will start to understand from just doing some of the basic mathematic equations and getting an understanding of what distance really means and the vastness of space, the billions of galaxies with billions of stars in each one. It changes your framework. And to look at all of that, to understand, when I was doing astronomy, I did the fusion equations, and from hydrogen to helium and carbon and so on, and got that understanding that most of the stuff that's around us that isn't hydrogen was definitely in the middle of a star at one point in time or other. We're literally made of star stuff, just like Sagan said.
Yeah.
And it's so crazy because it changes everything, but it's only a peak. It's only a peak because the only thing that we can know about the universe as astronomers is what we're able to observe. What light is it sending us? What energy? What electromagnetic spectra is it sending us? What does that tell us about it? What can we infer? That's interesting. When something's moving away, if it's at a fast enough speed, it changes the frequency of light. It's longer wavelengths. It's red. We have
Mm,
that red shift now. Okay, well, this is the way that, the universe is moving, and
mm,
here's this background radiation. But you get into all of that. We can literally look at the missing bands from stellar spectroscopy
mm,
and know exactly what the composition of that star is. And from that and its apparent magnitude and absolute magnitude and going through that classifying the stars, OBAFGKM, you go through that whole process and you'll understand the life cycles of stars and why things, then you start to understand the perturbations of space-time and understand where gravity, the property of gravity and, understand about chemical reactions and temperature. Once you get through all of that, then it hits you that in the universe, as far as we can tell, all that stuff that we're looking at, those billions of galaxies with billions of stars each, that's 5% or less.
but we have
Not
no idea really, do we? I mean, this
not
is just in our framework, which is
not talking about
limited.
that. Not
Okay.
talking about that. What I'm
Yeah.
talking about is the composition
Mm.
of the universe because it's 5% that matter and energy that we see, but it's 95% dark matter and dark energy. And everything that we know, every observation, every telescope, it's all that 5%. That's all we know. And that's how vast the topic is, how little we know about it. And yeah, as far as the visible universe as far as what we're able to see. Yeah, who knows how small that is? We might make inferences or guesses or whatever, but that's its own topic. Just talking about it's like knowing that the desk in front of you is made mostly of empty space, and then finding out that that empty space is actually something, and that the desk is wholly composed of something else, but it behaves like a desk because of a few
Perception.
micro properties of some small things.
Yeah.
And that's what the universe is like. Um, this moment when we were going through the measurements of distance when I was learning it the first time. And in order to conceptualize distance, they give you something called the astronomical unit.
Yeah.
And it's the average between aphelion and perihelion. So it's the average distance between the Earth and the Sun. And that's one AU, one astronomical U. If you go into a protractor and you were to pick out a single degree, out of 360 degrees or 180 if it's a half protractor, just a single degree, and then you were to divide that degree up into individual arc seconds,
Yeah.
you get into what's called the parsec. And the parsec is the distance at which that one astronomical unit is subtended by an angle of one arc second, which means you're going from like a 60th of a degree and then continuing to spread those fingers apart until you're literally the average distance between the sun and the earth. And that's how vast space is, that we have to think about it in terms of either that or how many years it takes for light to travel. That's how much distance we're talking about. And this is to look at something that we can only know 5% of if we're able to look at it and
Yeah.
not even touch it. And
Yeah.
that part of that 5% is touching it. So it's it's interesting because we're in an interesting age of mankind. I mean, 150 years ago, we were throwing people into sanitariums, and now we're starting to get an understanding of the human brain. You know, we
Yeah.
were using leeches a few hundred years ago. Now we use less leeches, but still use some. And and now we're rewriting retroviral capsids using chimeric antigen receptor therapy in order to be able to reprogram the human DNA to be able to fight cancer. Like just the thinking of what has happened in just the last couple of hundred years when Sagan's clock of us being on those last few seconds of the end of the year, as far as the shortness of humankind, what an exciting time to be alive.
It really is. I mean, we're talking about topics like in general media and general conversation, topics like quantum entanglement and parallel universes, and the vastness of the universe, and how small we are and how we are affected by these planets around us. And I don't know, it's brilliant. I don't know, we've gone forward, but we've also gone backwards in many ways.
And
Plant
that's
medicine is maybe being reintroduced to us in a way.
But that's the risk of that Kierkegaardian leap into the unknown.
Mhm.
Some of the things we're going to need to take with us, some of the
Yeah.
things we won't. And the only way we're going to get to grow is with those growing pains, is being open to failure. And like I was mentioning to you before, you know, there's a period when you're a child where, let's say you're learning to walk, adults will watch that process, know what is at the end of that process, and they'll smile to themselves as you stumble and you get there because they know what's at the end of that journey. But at some point, we grow into this age where failure means something different. It's no longer, growth, and the goal isn't what we're thinking about when we see failure. Partially because I think we're having to reprocess our own failures through watching others. And there's there's a social change of ego that happens with that, but no person ever acquired a skill without failing. And so it's so bizarre to have that mentality and to watch that effect sometimes in people.
Yeah, and to celebrate failure is something we should maybe encourage a little bit more. We've kind of tried it at home now. Every now and then, when we remember, we kind of go over, what did you fail at today, instead of what was the best part of your day.
I
um
didn't fail. I learned a way it doesn't work.
well, there you go. Yeah.
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 Yeah. And now that I know that it doesn't work that
Yeah.
way. Whether or
And
not you're
maybe
able to take
that's,
that information and move forward, that's the real question. And I think that's what we should be judging, not whether or not a person fails. Anyone can fail.
well, this is also in the words. We had a little bit of a touch on this topic as well earlier, where I find words very not confusing, not a good way of communicating, especially when we speaking intercultural, or when there's more than one language, you know, in the conversation, or second languages or third languages. What do we attribute to certain words? You know, we have meanings and experience that we bring to those words. So if someone tells you, you know, you're a failure, you know, that was just a big fail, there's a negative connotation to it. So yeah, do we change the word? Do we change the feeling that the word provides us?
I don't think that a lot of people think of it this way, but what I've learned is that spoken language, really, at its heart, is like it's like soul food. It's you we developed the use of verbal language early as animals to be able to flag our presence, to warn of oncoming, danger, to be able to build rapport, to find one another. And as the higher brain continued to develop, there was a desire for that higher brain to be able to look downward at that limbic system, at the emotions, and to be able to transmit that somehow, so that not everyone had to solve problems by hitting each other over the head. And at some point, we took those incredibly necessary evolved tools for our survival, and we turned them into soul food and used them to express ourselves and to communicate ideas with someone that we've never met before. And that notion that we're translating the human experience into an abstract set of barking sounds out of our larynx, it's very, very strange, but it's the shorthand that we have learned. We're tapping Morse code on the pipes that are laid there for a different purpose. And I think that there can be this reverence for words and language because people get attached to the mode of expression that they forget where it came from. And you have to have enough respect for the crudeness by which language evolves and changes. And I mean, just look here at, at the States. You had the entire native peoples, all of them with their own traditions and heritage. And then we first got here, from Europe, from Western civilization, and the mistake of calling it India and calling them Indians. And then, which is fine, that's done out of ignorance. But then you literally meet them and realize that there are tons of different, tribes with different names and different histories. And you
And
don't
it's
even
nowhere close
just,
to India.
but at that point, you just shrug your shoulders and say, you're Indians. And that approach, it shows that the utilitarian nature of language, that people only feel the need to modify it when it doesn't work for them as a fit. And it's only what you need to communicate about that someone is going to invest in language. If you go up to the Inuit people, up in the north, they have lots of different adjectives that they incorporate into nouns to describe snow because there's different kinds and it matters. If you look at like a language like Sanskrit, you know, they'll give you 40 different words for love. But in
And in
American,
symbols, I mean, like
yeah, yeah,
that
exactly. But you go to American English and we have 40 different expressions for the act of vomiting. So the focus of a culture, right, develops its language. That's how language changes, and you know, there's a crudeness to that process. And I think we're so far removed from that crudeness that we forget how big of a brush we're forced to paint with, is I think the problem.
it's also, we can't always trust to communicate in concrete ways. We kind of touched on that earlier as well. I mean, there's concrete, but there's also feeling that comes. So there's tone, there's pause, there's all those aspects within communication that is almost more important than the words sometimes. So if we can learn to understand that part of communicating with each other and not get too hung up on the word choice. You know, for me, English is a second language. So my husband always laughs at me because I sometimes I remember the kind of the idiom or the concept that I want to convey, but I've got it all mixed up. Because it's not something, you know, that's maybe inherent in my way of speaking. So yeah, what I'm trying to say is if we can take it as a bigger picture sometimes and not focus on just the word, because the words mean different thing to us differently.
Well, yeah, of course. I mean, even like for me, you know, as an autistic person,
Mm.
when we were first becoming aware of like Asperger's as a diagnosis and all of that, we unified under that word. Oh, there's a word for it, right? And that became a sense of identity. And then later on, when we start learning more about the history and where the name came from and whether or not we want to keep using that or incorporate it into the spectrum, and there will always be people who want to, you know, dig their heels in and be like, no, I like this word. This is the word that helped me find myself. So absolutely, there's different emotional contexts. And I think that sometimes you know, because you and I, we got hung up on the word tribe not that long ago,
Yeah.
you know,
Exactly. Yeah.
and for me, studying anthropology, the word tribe has about 50 different associations to it. And you use it as a conceptualization of community.
Mm.
And you know, to be able to talk about ancient values is a metafictive device for that. And so are both uses of those of that word is completely valid. They are completely valid ways to use the word. But our experience with the word, whether or not we have a positive or negative association with the word, we have to separate the signifier and the signified. And so it goes to show one of the most important questions you can ask someone when you're communicating is, well, what does that word mean to you? Well, I want someone I can trust. Well, what does that word mean to you? What does it mean for you to be able to trust someone? Because if I have a completely different idea in my mind of what, you know, qualifies trust, then I'm going to be putting a whole bunch of effort into doing things that don't really matter to you.
Mm.
So why don't you tell me what's important to you instead of just using the word? And we don't do that enough. And, you know, that is definitely something we could do better in communication.
I agree completely. I think we had this call the other night with a think tank with the Octopus Movement, and we were talking about specifically listening, you know, and how we listen. I know, how do we get people to listen? And I think that's an important aspect is within being heard, listening is a very big aspect to understanding and not only, you know, having the other party feel seen, but also to be seen, to have that communication process run as we intended to.
And well, the word itself is confusing too, because you can feel listened to.
Yeah.
And so if that's a feeling, then that means that everyone's feeling about that word is going to be different. And that's why when we started that think tank, I said, hey, we need to take a step back and ask ourselves what the goal is here, because we're all going to have different ways of getting there, but we have to agree where there is. Because if we don't, we may all be talking about different things while all talking about the same thing.
And that is communication, isn't it?
It absolutely is. Yeah.
Yeah. So for me specifically, the word goal makes me very anxious. It makes me feel like I need to do something that I'm not very sure about. So there we go back. You see my hands are sweating.
Yeah. Your
Um,
lower brain's like, get ready for a fight. You're like, what am I fighting? I don't know. Get ready for a fight.
exactly. So
Yeah.
once again, you know, it is, yeah, the words we use are important, but the message we want to convey is even more important. So however we get to do that, and I think that's the beauty of being in a non-linear group where it isn't, oh, I'm this diagnosis and I'm this diagnosis, therefore those people are all the same, and it's not that. It's just this big mush of people that are perceived themselves as being different from the straight and narrow, because remember, normal is only a setting on the dryer.
But even that desire to differentiate oneself is expressed differently from person to person. Often I'm asked, once the walls come down and people are just talking to me, after they know how much of a special interest psychology has been, they'll ask me weird questions like, what questions should I ask on a blind date? And I've seen this before and it struck me, and so I do repeat it. But what kind of crazy are you is a great question.
Yeah, or I mean, when I was studying psychology, it was like, do you know what I'm thinking? Or things like that. Or I shouldn't be talking to you because you are going to analyze me, or stuff like that, which is quite.
Or the internal narrative examining itself, because I swear it was so hard because you said the magic word. We were about to both say metacognition, and I was like, oh no, we've got to pull the Doberman back. We have to. That is
Yeah.
that is a bull mastiff that will take over this entire conversation. But metacognition is very interesting because with how we examine ourselves inside of our own minds and how we consider our own minds, looking at the mind, trying to measure the mind, and then we start to talk to other people and realize some people don't actually have a voice in their head. They don't have
I do not accept this theory. I do not believe
and
it.
and it's as weird for them to be talking to a person who does have a voice in their head as it is for us to be talking to someone who doesn't. I mean, I met someone once in the ASD community, and his voice in his head is narrated by Morgan Freeman.
Oh, that's brilliant.
And when he thinks about stuff, that mode needs to be like a calming, direct, and he
Yeah.
channels that kind of energy, and that's just where his brain goes. It's not that he idolizes Morgan
No,
Freeman
no,
or
no.
anything. It
Yeah.
just the voice has that tone to him. It reminds him of that voice always when
Yeah.
he's hearing it in his head. So it's that different experience, talking about that individuation and what that individual little piece of the blanket feels like.
Yeah.
I think it's a cool conversation too.
Yeah. It blows my mind that some people don't have a voice. I mean, how do they even solve anything? Or, it's
As
just.
I joked before, it's kind of don't put Descartes before the horse. But yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
because Descartes was doing that whole
Rene
question
Descartes.
of, yeah,
Realistic.
examining
Yeah.
the self,
I
and
am,
what
therefore.
can I
I think, therefore, I am.
yeah, cogito ergo sum or cognito ergo sum, depending on how you interpret it. And then, there's that whole idea of a solipsistic reality
Mm.
that something exists, everything exists, and the only thing that really exists is you, and that everything else is a phantom. And,
Which
we
is, your consciousness is only here, isn't it? So I
well, your
always think about
perception
your
is just
perception.
you.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
it is just you, because if we're all pieces of the same blanket, then there is only one voice. And that's what gets you, because maybe solipsism is the solipsism of the blanket and not the piece of the blanket, but the whole of the blanket. There's a whole bunch of different philosophical ideas to examine there. But I think that when you start getting into metacognition and considering the way that thoughts are formed and considering, the mind considering itself, where do values come from? Where, what motivates people? What motivates you? Um, talking to yourself in the third person, second person, first person. Like there's so many interesting little idioms that go into that whole process. And I find that fascinating too, because we do have the ability, if we close our eyes and think about it, or at least I do, maybe just it's because I'm a synesthete, but if I close my eyes and think about it, I can absolutely experience cold water on my skin. If I
Oh,
close
yeah.
my eyes and I think about it, I can absolutely hear the sounds from a memory.
Yeah.
If I close my eyes and I think about it, I can start to picture, and then things start to come together and I can re-experience something.
Mhm.
And some people don't do that. Some people can't do that, you know and so understanding that that's different for everyone, that's mind-boggling.
That's very difficult, yes, because we think that everyone perceives the world similarly to us. Everyone sees pink as that color or black as that. um all the colors together. My children always correct me. Black isn't really a color. um yeah, so our perception is really just that. But
What you hit him back
now
with is, okay, well, if black isn't a color, then why do you think the sky is blue? Because is
yeah.
unless you're going to say the Rayleigh scattering quantum effect, then maybe you don't know everything about color yet.
We'll be working on that next then.
Yeah, because I mean, when you start to understand that there are other systems that go underneath,
Mm,
a tungsten, for example,
mm,
when you apply a current through tungsten, because the electron configuration of different elements changes, in response to like current or heat or,
yeah.
depending on where they are and how stable and I'll get into all of the individual properties, but seeing how things behave differently under different circumstances and like there's a lot to unpack there, and that's just in the physical world, and our perception. I don't think a lot of people think about it, but if you have a gas giant like Jupiter,
Mm,
in order for it to not be burned away and for it to have an atmosphere, it has to have a magnetosphere. And if it has a magnetosphere, then that means that something's generating a magnetic field. So what could that be? And then we start thinking about the properties, and now we're considering, well, could it be hydrogen, but could it be behaving like a metal and under all of that pressure? Because, once you get that spatial, temporal displacement from space-time, the gravity starts to well in, you start to increase the pressure, but also the friction,
mm,
right, from the molecules all rubbing up against one another. And it's kind of like on a smaller scale than what happens in the sun,
mm.
what causes fusion. And the going theory, and it seems to be corroborated by the evidence, and we won't know until we go there. But the theory is that the hydrogen that's in the middle of that planet is liquid metallic hydrogen, and that it's an electron-free state, that all of the electrons from the hydrogen are able to flow freely
Oh wow.
around in that liquid metallic hydrogen, and that process creates that dynamo effect that generates the magnetosphere that protects that planet. Because you look at a planet like Mars with a dwindling magnetosphere, and then the atmosphere goes away and starts to burn off. So just how different things are, and how our conceptions of the way that things work or don't work, and how we have to challenge ourselves with new information. That's why I love astronomy, because
Mm,
astronomy takes you out of the known and puts you at the edge of the unknown, and you realize how tiny, how insignificant human existence really is, and how the only way, because the one thing that astronauts always say is they go up into space, and once they get enough distance from the problem
mhm.
and they see that we're just this little blue dot and that there's a chaotic sea of nothingness and entropy and energy and danger, and that we're so focused on what's happening right in front of us that the whole world could come to an end in 10 years, and the whole 10 years before it, we would, until we saw it in the sky, we would just be arguing with one another over petty things. It changes your experience of the human condition. And if you get enough into astronomy, I think you can take that journey without having to go into space. That's my opinion.
Yeah. Oh, and astronomy itself is big. I mean, you know, being so small and being on this little ball in the middle of this sea of very unknown. I mean, we don't even know what all the gases are or could be or might be. You know, we have a very limited knowledge of the things that we have here in our little tiny dot.
5%,
Yeah,
because it's not 95% of it's dark matter and energy, and we haven't been
yeah.
able to quantify all that yet. So to think that we've learned so much from so little, it's a peek through the keyhole. That's
Mm.
it. And
And there's so much more. And then, I mean, I strongly believe that we're also influenced by the movement of these planets and moons and sun and connections between these because they have magnetism and it does affect us in a physical and metaphysical way.
well, remember also though that correlation isn't causation,
Yeah.
you know, because if, let's say, something like the seasons are affected by the planetary movements and stuff like that, if you take a step back from the individual experience, and we're all in the same blanket, right? Then the different ebbs and tides of the universe, and this little system that we have powered by the sun as we're making our way around a 26.5-degree axial tilt, and a little oblate spheroid just, circling away, just trucking along. And that process may put us through different influences that change the behavior of the world. And therefore, we may correlate it to something that we can see in the sky, when maybe that just happens to be something that happens along with that phenomenon, but that's the phenomenon that we can see. You
Yeah.
know, you get into the Forer effect at some point in psychology, that Barnum thing, the Barnum effect, where, you know, if you make stuff that's general enough, and it'll apply to certain people, and why are eyewitnesses unreliable and so on. But if you take a step back out of the individual experience, because I think that people take things like astrology, and they get so focused on what it means for them individually, that they forget how unimportant individuality really is, and that there are much bigger questions that we should be asking. And I think that the reason that I don't like disciplines like that is, even if they are 100% concrete, aren't there more important things that we need to focus on than whether or not something's affecting our temperament, or this particular time of the year makes us want to nestle down more? Like, whether or not, I think understanding yourself is important, so that you have the ability to know how you're going to set out on your journey. But I think where you're going is so much more important than where you are.
It for me, it's also part of connection, though.
Hmm.
We've separated ourselves through our development, maybe not the right word, as a society or as a species, that we've separated ourselves from nature, from everything around us, including what's going on in the bigger picture. So I mean, I'm not talking horoscopes as astrology, because those are very different things.
Right.
But there is a connection. We are connected to this crazy universe out there as well. We're not sitting in a corner somewhere, not influenced by what's going on out there, whether it's a solar flare or a eclipse. Eclipses have had many spiritual meanings throughout time. People used to celebrate them differently, and these things do have an influence on us, just as the moon has an influence on the tides and seasons and the sun and all that.
I mean, the
We are also part of it.
conquistadors used the eclipse to swindle the Central American people into thinking that they were gods and giving them their
Yeah.
food. I mean, there's a whole bunch of different things that you can infer and pull from that. I think that, you know, understanding the human condition, I mean, that's if we spent all of our time doing that, we would never have the answer. And so it's a question of how much time do we spend looking forward to where we are now. And there's this idea of, human beings have escaped the natural world or changed the world, or moved away from the natural. But at the same time, us having to make modifications to the environment, to the way that we do things, to be able to increase our these are all adaptations of the same system that gave us intellect in the first place. It's an evolutionary system. And our advantages have been piling up because it turned out that that evolutionary advantage of cognition, of problem solving, of tool using allowed us to do different things with what we had in our environment, accomplish different things, spend our time doing different things. But I think that we can kind of forget that us getting to the point where we can use the tools the way that we do, there's not some magical point at which we stop the animal narrative. When a chimpanzee grabs a stick and uses it to get termites out of a hole, just because it took that stick off of the branch, off of the tree, to feed itself termites because that was a better way to do, has it moved away from the natural world? At what point does repurposing our environment for better survival become unnatural? And why do we picture a chemical vat when we talk about that? Because the whole world around us is a chemical vat. Maybe it's a matter of perspective, but it's important to see, I think, that we see as we start to take over more and more of the planet from having these unchecked advantages, that the natural result of that order as we start to dominate into new ecosystems is we start to create scarcity of other organisms and environs and biomes, and and that's the same thing. If you take some rats or something to a place where they have no natural predators and let them grow unchecked, they will completely change that ecosystem to their benefit, or the detriment of everyone else or whatever, until they grow to their maximum size. But have they escaped the natural world because one of them hopped on a ship or got on the back of a turtle? Or like, at what point do we cross that barrier into the unnatural? And what is unnatural? I almost want to go Socratic with that and just take a step back, because if we're only looking at 5%, I mean, maybe this is part of our whole human story. And maybe all of these things that we're doing to destroy every single species on this earth, maybe in 7 years, we might have enough knowledge and technology to make an arc of ourselves to be able to get off of this planet if something bad is going to happen to it. And every single thing we've done to every single natural organism on this planet will have been worth it from the perspective of the human species, because otherwise that's just all animals dying out. Instead, it's all animals except us. So it's really about your perspective, in my opinion.
Yeah, I'd like to challenge you on whether
Do
we
it.
are
I love it. Let's do it.
whether we are doing this for the betterment of us, our species or our development. I don't think we're doing much better than we might have. We might be on power and greed and how tall our buildings are and things like that, but how connected are we as humans to each other? Isn't that where it's also an important element? I mean, there's wars going on, many of them. People, my husband's now watching this very interesting woman from North Korea explaining what's actually going on there.
Hmm.
And I mean, everywhere, the state, it's just, I feel that we may be not doing so well in general.
Well, what happens if you have too many different colonies of army ants in a field? Once you
Yeah.
get to the point where resources and territory start to matter, there's going to be conflict. It's each species trying to, find its own equilibrium and survive. And if you are going to talk about success and betterment, you have to remember the system that brought us here, the evolutionary system, because that is the only system that you can make that continuation of, are we better or worse than when we first came here, unless you inject a brand new human value system into that equation. Because the ultimate goal of the evolutionary system is to propagate our genes and to be able to increase our population and survive. And I think from that aspect, we're doing remarkably well. We're outliving almost all the other organisms now, displacing them, moving into their territory, disrupting their ecosystem to make it into our, planting different plants, changing it just for us. The only thing is that there is a desire to preserve what we are destroying in the process of doing that. But at any organism left unchecked is going to do that. The only difference is that we have the brains and the tools to be able to do more than throw rocks at one another.
Yeah, it doesn't I don't think it's doing that well, in the development. I think there's a lot more in pulling it back a bit. If we were to accept the evolutionary theory, then you know are we really doing anything more than just populating more, a group
And
of
this is
people?
where meaning comes from, and this is
Yeah.
where philosophy, I mean, these are important questions. I mean, even if we discard the evolutionary narrative for a second, um, there is this thing of authenticity. And, I speak of it from a more existential perspective when I
Mm.
say authenticity. But when you look at, and I can just examine my own society for this. So I'll just talk about the United States here. You know, we spend enough extra money on luxury pet food over what it would take to satisfy the basic nutrition requirements for our pets. We spend enough extra to be able to provide fresh drinking water to the entire human civilization, the entire world around. And instead we spend that on making our pet food taste better. There is a definite effect that tribal or pack mentalities have on our ability to care about other people. But then there's also inauthenticity in our own dopamine-led processes of pleasure. And the easiest way that I describe this is if you look at, let's say, our pollution. Let's say, we're all worried here in the United States about our carbon credits and are we using enough solar panels and this and that. If you look at the entire industrial complex of the United States and the pollution that it puts out, and then you compare that to the damage that's done to the Sumatran rainforest in order to be able to give us vegetable shortening for the food that we eat, to increase the shelf life of products and to emulate butter, they're literally clear burning millions of acres of Sumatran rainforest with innocent orangutans and Sumatran tigers and elephants and still alive in the forest, burning it to the ground to keep up with you, changing all of their laws locally so that they can keep up with the demand that the United States has. And you get these hydrogenated oils from like palm oils, and because these are chemically made in a process. I mean, they literally boil it with aluminum, in order to create chemical changes that start to move it closer to a plastic.
Yeah.
And you get arterial plaque and buildup as a result because it doesn't have the same exit rate in the body, and it starts to behave like a trans fat, and you get heart disease, and you get stroke, and you get cancer. And what are the leading causes of death in the United States? Heart disease, stroke, cancer. So the fact that we like our cinnamon rolls and our cake frosting and our non-dairy creamer, because if you look at the side of a non-dairy creamer powder that you're pouring into your coffee, it's almost pure palm oil. If we're doing that, and you can put a big V and say it's vegan, but it doesn't matter because it's definitely not vegan, because we're literally displacing an entire environment in order to be able to make it.
But no one
And
cares. As long as the V's there, it's all good.
and it's killing us. So the irony of seeing an environmental protest over a factory that's putting out the wrong stuff into a riverbed, when the people that are standing there literally have food and drink that are made from the product that's not only killing the people in the United States, but is affecting global warming and is generating more, damage to the biome than, the entire industrial complex of the United States. And we're nibbling on that while holding our protest sign. There is a big problem with perspective,
And
and that
trust. And trust, because I trust my doctor who says I should rather eat margarine or whatever that's called. I trust the government who says that, whatever they want to say. And I trust the company that put the V on it because they said this is safe for animals. I'm not harming it or eating or whatever any animals. So there we come back to our main topic for this month, trust. Who do we actually get to trust except ourselves? So the onus lies on me to know what I'm putting into my body or what I'm protesting against and what I'm holding in my hand.
But there is an ethical question there, because if every time that you go and you do a certain action, I hit you with some heroin, I'm going to start modifying your behavior over time, whether you like it or not.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
if you start to take a look at the way that fats and sugars behave in the brain, because part of that pleasure response in the nucleus accumbens and the rest of it is based on gustatory responses led for eating sugars and food seeking and all of that. it is possible for an individual or a collective or a government or a company or whatever to get people addicted on a feeling or get people addicted on a substance or on a product. And that changes human cognition too. Maybe
And
those
behavior.
people are all being trustworthy,
Mm.
but maybe there's a hidden mechanism that causes, that we don't know about that is causing that to not be authentic. There's all kinds of different ways of interpreting a lot of this, but what I would call attention to is that because you mentioned cognitive dissonance last time,
Mm.
the notion of sitting there, because this is information is readily available. They're not hiding it. I
No.
mean, you can literally go on YouTube and just type in Sumatran rainforest palm oil,
Yeah.
orangutan, and you will see 10 documentaries all talking about this gigantic, beautiful rainforest with all these creatures being burned down so that we can have vegetable spread and creams and frosting.
But why would I want to see that? Why would I type that in? Because I don't want to see that. Because if I know, then I'm responsible. So if I don't
Right.
know, then I'm not.
And I think that's where the moral consequence thing comes into. And we talked about, objective or absolute morality versus subjective last time. And you know, there are certain lines you have to be really careful with crossing too. Like for instance, the death penalty. This always gets to be a big hot topic all the time, right? Yeah, let's talk about that on
Don't
our
get me
podcast,
started.
right? Yeah. But I have a much different way of looking at it. I
Yeah.
instead of arguing over whether or not it's right or wrong to, if you come to our country and kill someone, we'll kill you back.
Yeah.
Whether or not that's inherently right or wrong, you have to take a step back and understand that that punishment is being served by a justice system that constantly makes honest mistakes and
That's not correct.
sometimes makes
Exactly.
not so honest mistakes.
Yeah.
And it's all well and good if a person's done something to start thinking about whether or not they deserve punishment or rehabilitation or whatever your model of crime and punishment is. But what if it's the wrong person? And what do you do when you give someone a punishment that you can't take back if it turns out that you're wrong? And everyone, has all kinds of opinions on it, but what if it was you? What if,
Yeah.
the
Agree.
wrong evidence was there, the wrong positioning, and you were in the wrong place at the wrong time, knowing that you had the ability to continue seeking the truth and prove your innocence, as opposed to whatever crime it was that people thought you guilty enough of that they felt that you should die, and having to have that conversation instead. Because I think if we kill one innocent person, that makes us all murderers.
Well, exactly, and that's my exact argument on this as well. Coming from Africa, who isn't, Africa in general isn't a space of real, can't really trust the justice system necessarily from whichever side you look at.
Well, we have it on the news here in the States all the time. We'll have a,
Yeah.
person in a crime lab who's falsified results, or,
Yeah.
new DNA evidence will come out and some person will been in prison under the wrong sentence for 44 years. And, these stories happen. What happens if it happens to you? You know, People don't think about that stuff. And I think that whether or not we can agree that killing someone who's done something terrible is right or wrong, I think we can all agree that killing someone who's innocent
It's not.
isn't right.
No.
So if we create a system where we have the opportunity to do that kind of wrong, I think that's inherently wrong. Otherwise, moral objectivism has taken over, and you're just making decisions based off of emotion, and that doesn't help anybody.
Well, that's also not a justice system, and often that happens. So we had this thing in Israel now, where they wanted to take more control over who's going to be judges and the just and
Hmm.
inherently, my opinion is that we cannot trust systems in general because it's not perfect. They aren't ever going to be perfect. So if
I
we're going to put
can't even trust you to describe an apple to me in a way that'll make me understand. You know, I,
exactly.
you can't describe a color to a person who doesn't have a sight.
No.
There's every single person's comparative understanding of even what things are is subject to personal experience. So this idea of using this crude tap on the pipe language in this social model, but the real question always has to be, what would we replace it with? And I think that we need to spend more time on that question with a lot of things, and I find that whole authenticity argument, and it makes me sad here in the States because we have this this whole two political party adversarial thing going on here. And I don't think that people take a moment to think, this caucus system, um, this whole idea of backing a candidate with a party, the whole thing just subverts the entire idea of an election system. If you meet privately before something in the government happens in order to change the results of that, not when people vote their conscience, but based on who they've made alliances with, you've literally subverted the entire system. This notion of, well, all of these opinions get grouped over here, and you basically get to choose the lesser of two evils. And it doesn't make a lot of authentic sense. And yet, because of our sense of social belonging and the way that we respond to antagonistic ideas and the desire of people to band up into groups, we've robbed ourselves of that third party candidate, that new idea, that new system that can come in, because we haven't gotten, I think more than 5% to an independent vote since like 1963 or something like that. So, the idea that we've developed this system that is completely designed to only give us two options before we even start them into the process of government, it makes you wonder, even if that system is self-correcting, has the fact that that has happened to it made it so it's no longer able to self-correct? And what do you do about it? Because once the runaway train has gotten to a certain point, it's almost like you have to tear the whole system down to make it better. So, and it seems like we have to have these really colossal failures to jump forward, because we talked about failure. When we have an economic collapse, well, then we try something new. If we have a social collapse, we try something new. If we have a one-child policy and it starts to change the demographic, well, we got to change it. We have to learn from those mistakes, and we're not learning. We've privatized incarceration and made
Yeah.
for-profit companies in charge of people's incarceration, and we've made the healthcare system into something where people get to profit and greed becomes involved. We have campaign candidates who have lobbyists and special interests that are all donating money, and they all know each other. And I got really sad because we had our first female candidate, Hillary, and regardless of where you sit on the political spectrum, whether you were like, hell yes, we got our first female candidate, or you were like, oh God, whatever your impression was, I think the fact that she had to literally reverse all of her positions in order to be able to nestle into that system, to be able to have a chance to be supported and to run, that as the first lady, she was talking about, free health care for everyone, and, higher standards for, and pay for teachers and education, and, all of these humanitarian ideas. And that by the time that she went through that homogenization, that process to actually be able to be supported, that all of the right stickers had to be put onto her uniform for her to be able to compete in that arena. And without the support of the industries that she was decrying previously, she wouldn't have been able to get into the position to make that. So how much of your morality do you have to sacrifice in order to even be a viable choice in a system that's so installed already? And you could use it to say negative things about her, you could use it to say negative things about the system, but the fact that a person had to betray all of their public opinions and completely change their ethos and all of that just to be able to participate shows how far gone we are. So it wasn't that I was for or against Hillary, it was that I watched the process that she went through to get to that election, and I was aghast, not at her, but at what we've done to this system.
Yeah. And yeah, it's all the systems. It's not just one system. And as you said, the only way that I can see forward for it too is for the systems to break down, because we can't fix it from within. the within isn't working. It had been tried, been
It's
done
like
that.
trying to do therapy on yourself. It's not going to work. It's
What?
just not.
That's why I study psychology. What do you mean?
Yeah, you can't reframe cognitive beliefs without an outside perspective. But that's the problem though, is in an adversarial system like that, then if only one of those two groups that are in power makes the decision to be better, then the other power takes control because of that weakness, that doing the right thing has become weakness. And so like I would get these political campaigners texting me around election time, and it was all, you need to vote this way so the bad guys don't win, whoever the bad guys are.
Yeah.
And if you're not voting according to your conscience, to what you actually believe serves the public good, then you shouldn't be casting a ballot in the first effing place. But there's this bizarre personal kaleidoscope of feeling like we should legislate our morality, that because we believe something is right or wrong, that we should make it illegal. And if there's one thing I would have thought we would have learned in the States, it would have been from prohibition. Just because, here's something that does cause social evil. Alcohol can be a very bad thing. It can hurt people. It can do this, it can do that. But did making it illegal help anyone? And instead, when you make something a crime, then only criminals want to do it. And then you don't have the regulatory processes to not kill people with poisonous product. And you have authority figures so people don't have to shoot each other with Tommy guns when they have a disagreement.
Mhm.
And you have to ask yourself, does making something illegal, not is it right or is it wrong, but does it make sense? Does it serve the public good? And if we get away from that and start legislating our personal morality, then and we stop serving the public good and we're only worried about special interests in ourselves. And I think this whole lens of the internet and social media and stuff, it has shortened our attention span and increased our self-involvement when it comes to hearing the opinions of others. And I think that that's a sad thing. It's sad that I would listen to a radio broadcast from 50 years ago, and you could hear people disagreeing about things, and supplying, where their opinion comes from, and respecting one another for having different opinions. And now the same conversation just results in someone pointing at someone else and calling them a monster and then hitting a mute button so they don't have to listen to them anymore. And it's saddening because we're losing that ability to critically think and expose ourselves to ideas that we don't agree with, and then try and harmonize with those people. That social goal, I think, has been lost.
But we can't grow if we only follow one opinion that we've based on only being supplied with certain information. And that's what social media is doing quite well at the moment with its algorithms and its us and them kind of narrative. But we have to create spaces where people can disagree and do it respectfully. I mean, we need to disagree because that's the only way we grow.
But I think though integral to this whole process is journalism.
Yeah.
And
Well, there
it's
is
it's it
without having.
saddens me because the newspaper has largely died, and these multimedia conglomerate companies have taken over. And whichever side of the fence you're on, it doesn't matter. You know, the if you think back to our history, right? Because if we don't learn from our history, we're doomed to repeat it.
Yeah.
The things that we record in history and how we record them, that's the controlling of information. That's what propaganda is, right? If some horrible fascist government comes in and takes over, they're going to control the history, because if they can do that for a generation, then people will believe what they're told, and only the people who know the truth can hold on to it and fight it. And what journalists are doing is they're in the act of writing that history now.
Mm.
And if we think about the special interests that people who have that important job have, then you start to see a twist in that narrative. And that's when we've moved out of the newspaper, and we moved to just reposting each other's stories on, online and stuff like that. Like, I can speak for the States. We no longer have those journalists that are sitting there in those committee meetings between senators, getting to hear what's being said behind closed doors because they have a press pass, and keeping the people informed on who's making the decisions and why.
Without
And
bias.
Yeah, and it makes it so that you can't have an informed electorate, because if you've controlled the information and the history, then really you're going right back to that whole idea of only giving them a couple of choices to pick from and calling that freedom.
Yeah.
And I hope that my hope is that at some point we'll recognize that we're becoming like the Roman Empire, and we get to look backward and see the mistakes that were made before it's too late. And we'll see. I have no idea. There are every culture has gotten its own takeaway from change and strife. Like in France, you have, an entire people that are willing to go into the streets and talk about the things that bother them because
Mm.
that's part of their culture, their heritage. So that mindset of whether or not that government exists to shelter people, or if it serves as an extension of the people, or if it ends up being a guard dog, or it ends up, there are lots of different roles that it can take. And that's a group decision that we can't take lightly. And we're being taught to ignore it and let other people make those decisions for us.
Mm. Which brings me back to my theory that a global tribe where we have different cultures and different backgrounds and different experiences is a way forward, where we can actually learn from each other.
Yeah, once you said global in front of it, I'm all for it.
Yeah,
Because the only problem
yeah.
with the tribal mentality is that there's another tribe and we don't
Mm.
like them. So if we're all one tribe, but then again, if everyone's different, no one is, or if everyone's the same, no one is, or,
But
like,
yeah, that's this crazy moon lady by the river is also part of the tribe, even though she's different. And so is the hunter, and then there's um the cook and the wood collector, and everybody is who they are meant to be.
the
But
non-binary autistic guy who
that's it.
taught psychology to sex workers in Nevada. Yeah. Yeah, he's the crazy moon
Definitely.
lady. Yeah. Let's go ask the
Yeah,
crazy moon lady. Yeah. No, I get it.
yeah,
I get it.
yeah. um yeah, because we are a global tribe, really. We've just positioned ourselves, we did before we were all kind of able to connect to each other. This was one good thing that this whole COVID thing brought us, is that many more people realize that we are only a computer screen away from each other, or whatever form of communication works for you.
Or alternatively, that we're all sitting alone in our rooms talking to a piece of plastic like crazy people. It all depends on your perspective. But, one thing I will say is that um, it's sad to me that the people who would most benefit, like for example, from hearing this conversation, are also the people that would never listen to it. And, the ability to have a conversation, to disagree, to, okay, well, why do you think that? Let's
Yeah,
talk about that. The ability to do that and have it be positive and go somewhere positive, find out what we agree on and what we don't agree on, and then for both of us to grow from that process. So many people have shut themselves to that. They just put on their headset when they're, on the bus or whatever, and pretend that no one else exists until they get to their destination. But I remember when I was a kid, one of two things would happen. Everyone would sit in the bus really quiet because no one had coffee,
yeah,
and we would all stare out the window and just pretend that we were by ourselves, or people would start interacting.
yeah,
And then you would see conversations, and then sometimes people would lean in and want to hear more of a really interesting conversation. Those social spaces have changed. That was my generation's, as a kid's Facebook was sitting there and, listening into what was going on the other side of the lunchroom.
yeah,
And that was how we got our news, like,
yeah,
and now we've got a whole bunch of filtered, reconstituted messages that are all focused on us instead of on exchanging ideas and debating. And once we get a couple of generations of that, if we let it go on too long, the generation that's interested in having those conversations will go away. That new social value will take over. And until that counter hegemonic element comes back in and they want to be unlike their parents and they decide to start having those conversations. And if they don't have the history of a generation they actually remember to draw on, they'll have to start from scratch and make all of the same mistakes that we had to when we came out of the dark ages.
yeah,
you know because if you look at that whole rebirth, that whole um re-entry of all the scholars from the East and how it changed the world, after the fall of Constantinople and the fall of the Roman Empire. And, we had this whole time period where all of these great thinkers were just kind of flourishing elsewhere, and society became base, and it became, became ruled by, our impulses and our prejudices, and, being told what was matter. There's that whole allegory of Catholicism that happened.
Yeah.
And if we hadn't have had that renaissance, that rebirth, if we hadn't had that reinjection of ideas, we're already stunted for it. There's already parts of the world that have been stunted. And I mean, I probably am included in that, stunted by that process of insular thinking. So look how much we lost just in that period of time. How much will we lose next time if we don't place value on it? And if we don't learn from those lessons, then we're not going to evolve, because we're just going to have to keep on making the same mistakes on a cycle with fancier and fancier lights to look at while we're in the middle of doing it.
Yeah. And this makes me think of what Yoko said the other night, which is so true. I mean, Yoko comes from a time and experienced a time where all of this really did, World War II and all that, the Holocaust. And she mentioned that we can't look all there. We have to look here. And how do I influence my environment? And how do I connect with you? How do I create a space where it's enjoyable and it's fun to find out why you think how you think and how you perceive your world, and then I carry that over to my children or my friends, or and they maybe look at things in that frame of mind, and so we adjust our environments. But we can't go out there screaming and shouting like, why are you people not listening? Because then they're not going to hear you.
Well, it's funny because not funny, haha, funny, weird.
Yeah.
When we start talking about the Holocaust, there's so much packed into that. And it's interesting how society changes or moves away from, or even tries to turn a blind eye to because they don't want to look at, or you know and it also starts to engage our sensitivities too. you know there's a there's a point at which a topic becomes so offensive that even having a conversation about it for the purpose of truth becomes a bad thing. And that's the power of words, because like if you look at something um like the swastika, for example, I mean, that was a religious symbol,
Yeah.
that was reappropriated from a different belief system and then now has become a symbol of hate.
But
You
it's
know,
not really. So if you knew the history of it, then
yeah.
you could see it in a different light.
Well, and this happened too, when I was in college, I went into the lobby, and here's a building that's funded by federal tax dollars, right? This is just a private like university, because that's a whole different subject, right? And they've got a Christmas tree and nothing else in the lobby. And it started to make me think, because the evergreen boughs, that was reappropriated from the Druids and the pagans.
Mm.
The star at the top, that was for worship of the sun god and Mithra and all of that. You've got the Nordic and Scandinavian tales of the
I
great
found out
hunt.
about this like this year, about
Yeah.
the mushroom element and
Hmm.
the psilocybin kind of part to the Christmas story. I was like, why do we not have the bigger picture? Because we are,
Well, and this is where things get interesting, right? And because in some ways the whole Christmas thing kind of also reflects what goes on anthropologically with things like angels. You
yeah.
know, most people in the Abrahamic religions, for example, if you actually look at their religious texts, angels are this completely separate race of beings that were created as messengers and all of this, all kinds of things. And two big things happened. The first was during Greco-Roman times, when we were anthropomorphizing so much, because that's what the Greeks and the Romans did. They made these they were larger than life people almost.
Yeah.
And once we got into that in art and trying to paint the divine and sculpt the divine and all of that, we look at these ancient Abrahamic tales of like these rings of lights with 6 wings and stuff like that, and all of a sudden it looks like a person. So there's the first transition that's really weird because you have very specific ancient texts that talk about, the different kinds of angels and what they look like and all of that, and yet the mental conception of it is a person with wings, which comes from, Greco-Roman. So there's that first transition, right? But then the second one happens where where ancestor worship almost enters into the equation. Because even though like a holy book, like let's say the Bible, let's say, says that we sleep in the earth until the day of judgment and that you're specifically prohibited from talking to the dead, culturally, anthropologically, we will tell, our daughter that grandma's an angel in heaven and she'll look up at her ceiling at night and, say goodbye to grandma. We culturally and anthropologically take pick and choose and incorporate and change regardless of what the belief system says. And we cherry pick those things because that's what we need anthropologically. Now, whether or not you want to get into the debate of what is true or isn't in this belief system or that's a whole different topic. But I think that it's interesting because the Christmas tree is the same way. You could ask some people and they'll say that it's secular.
Mm.
But interestingly, if you go into a text like the Bible, let's say you go into Jeremiah, it says that you should not bring evergreen boughs into the house and deck them with silver and gold, and that it is a pagan practice, and that you will become unclean for the process of doing that. You know, but so the book literally says that it's a religious practice and it's not your practice, and yet we'll
It's
take it
accepted. Yeah.
and say that it's secular.
Yeah.
And then you'll get there's because you get that realignment of the calendar from Pope Gregory, and there was this desire to basically, because people love their celebrations, people love their culture so much so that they'll ignore where angels come from if it's in their holy book, right? And Pope Gregory saw that and was like, well, then they like their fertility festival and they like their winter solstice and they like their spring equinox and all of that. So what I'll do is I'll move the calendar, and that way they get to hold on to some of their heritage and I can bring more of them over to Christianity. And what that really is doing is you're kind of doing like a substitution switcheroo with a society. I mean, that's an intentional decision to misinterpret a narrative for the sole purpose of religious conversion. And you're doing it by subverting another culture with a group of people that ultimately, did the Inquisition and ended up killing people who had different beliefs. So, in a way, that entire process represents a kind of genocide. And if you look at the things that actually happened on Saturnalia, the pagan traditions, you have everything from riots, and you go to Poland and there's a Saturnalia Day riot where a whole bunch of Jews were killed and women were raped, and you know the associations of this holiday and this date and I mean, look at Valentine's Day. That's
I was just gonna say
you know,
Valentine's
they
Day.
used to
Yeah.
literally get, leather straps
Yeah.
and beat women across the
Yeah.
ass and have people, take bone tokens out of
Yeah.
out of a
And
hat and
they
go.
they paid them up for, I think, for a
Hmm.
year,
Hmm.
or a
Some of them
long
stayed
period of
together, some of
time.
them didn't,
Yeah.
whatever. Yeah.
Yeah.
There's all of these strange things, and then when we get into the modern manifestation, we change it or we reinterpret it. But to just jump to the assumption that it's secular
Yeah.
is to ignore everything that came before. And if you want to deny another civilization, its culture, and its rights, you just have to pretend that they don't exist. Look at the Armenians,
Yeah.
So for me, when I see a Christmas tree, I see a swastika. I see a religious symbol that was reappropriated by an organization that ultimately used it to promulgate genocide.
Mm.
And I think that does a disservice to the pagans who actually, would have like a druidic tradition. I think that does a disservice to the Jews who were, very unfairly treated on many of those holidays. I think that it does a disservice to all of the different religions and stuff that aren't represented in that lobby because people are trying to point at that tree and call it secular and then not make a space for other belief systems by calling it secular and saying, no, no, that's a religious symbol you can't have here, but you can have this because this is secular. No, it's not. So
Yeah.
for me, I started a petition at my college to have the Christmas tree removed from the lobby. And I made an entire presentation about it, and I did a PowerPoint slide and everything. And I got hundreds of signatures once I explained
Mm.
to people why it was a problem. Once I sat down and had those conversations, when I was willing to invest the time, and they took it down, you know. But what was the first response? You're trying to ruin Christmas, you
Yeah.
know? And like on Earth Day, I protested recycling
Oh, that's an
because
interesting one.
because recycling is only good for the environment in certain circumstances. There are materials and there are areas in which recycling is bad for the environment, whether it's through extended transportation in order to get it to a recycling center and you're creating a carbon footprint or what have you, or there are materials in which, we have like a very continuous flow of materials, and all we're really talking about is landfill space, like paper, for example. Save the paper, save the trees. We grow trees to make paper. It's like saying we're running out of potatoes. Like they literally plant new ones, and then if we're cutting down rainforests and making parchment out of it, then okay, like I'll get behind that in a heartbeat. But this is a renewable industry, and we're just consuming a product that you're going through extra steps so that you can feel good, not because it's making a difference. You know, it feels good to give your pet better dog food, but maybe it would feel better for a person to have access to drinking water who doesn't have to walk 15 miles with a jug on their head to get it in the morning.
Yeah.
You know, there's a lot of ignorance out there. And I just feel like if we could just get to the point where we're able to have the conversation,
Yes.
then I can say, hey, recycling aluminum makes a ton of sense. It takes more energy to get it out of the ground than it does to reconstitute it. It's a mineral, resource that's limited. It, we're taking the stuff that's would be cheaper for us to recycle and better for the environment for us to recycle, and instead we're using up valuable landfill space with it. That's one problem, right? So that's a great reason to recycle. But if you look at something like papers or certain plastics or whatever, you might actually be damaging the environment by doing that, thinking that you're doing something good, feeling great because you're sorting out, taking the extra effort to sort out your trash, when instead what you could really be doing to make the environment better is not putting the frosting on your cake or the non-dairy creamer into your coffee.
Hmm.
And all of that comes from information, but people don't want to be shown that they have cognitive dissonance. And I know that you like cognitive dissonance, so you've got to know how people react to it.
And that is very a very big motivator for me within the Content College Club. That's what I do at the beginning of every month. I go and look for these tales and myths and um, pagan or otherwise festivals that correlate with these other things we seem to celebrate, like Valentine's Day, like the Festival of Hysteria.
Beltane, Samhain, yeah, all of
Yeah,
that, yeah.
all of that. And it's fascinating. And I think it could provide us with so much more connection to what's actually been, our we aren't just the person that we are now. I mean, we have ancestral DNA and all kinds of stuff happening. So we should really, I'm interested. I know there are other people that are interested, but they just never heard of it or know that there is such a concept out there. I
Well,
mean,
we have a weird narrative of history too, because again, whatever people choose to record is what people remember,
yeah.
you know, and some of the most important things we don't talk about. One thing that I have for respect, deep respect for the German people is the way that they have culturally and socially come together to acknowledge where things went wrong. As part of their education system is recognizing what happens when a demagogue enters into that situation, starts to promote a private agenda. They learned from that, and they are able to hold their heads high, knowing that they have moved in a completely different direction as a result of it. But if you look at the States, you know, we kind of sweep what happened to the Native Americans under the rug. We don't talk about so many things, and this doesn't have to be some abstract thing from, hundreds of years ago. Like there was a point where we accidentally shot down like an Iranian passenger jet full of innocent people just because we thought that its moves looked threatening on the radar, but it was squawking its normal signals and everything, and we downed this aircraft, with all of these innocent people in it. And our president at the time was quoted as saying, I will never apologize for America." Like, that's a lesson to learn from. If you look at
Yeah.
what happened in Guatemala, our local fruit interests, our companies, the Guatemalan coup d'etat, we literally deposed a democratically elected leader and installed a dictator to serve our fruit interests. There are so many, Woodrow Wilson threw black delegates out of the White House. You know, there's so much, Black Wall Street, you know, these horrible things that happen.
Mm.
And the only thing that you need to do to have those same things happen again is to allow them to be forgotten. And not writing them into the history books, not having the conversation, being afraid to say an opinion. Like, I can give you one right now. You know, as an example, one of the things that we're not allowed to talk about is eugenics. It's a bad word. It's a very, very bad word because it's been used as an excuse to cause untold amount of human suffering. So much so, just like the Holocaust, we can't talk about the topic. We're not allowed to have a conversation about it. But by the same token, there's a there's a need, I think, as we continue to evolve technologically, as we continue to develop these tools and to allow people to survive with new medical technology and new advancements and new narrative, that people that would never have been able to be around are now around. Because 500 years ago, if a baby was born with way too many teeth in its mouth, it would pass on. Those genes wouldn't stay in the pool. If someone was born with a heart on the outside of their body, or you know, a a liver problem that caused an insulin imbalance, or whatever it is, that nature's self-correcting system, right, would make it so that if those people didn't make it to breeding age, that they would be out of the gene pool, and that system would correct itself. I mean, we're literally next to a giant fusion reactor throwing radiation at us every day. The food that we eat literally is attacking our genes, and our body's trying to fight it. So this notion that if we've completely subverted the evolutionary process, or have we? I mean, that's the other question, right?
Yeah.
Is all of this inside of the evolutionary process, and we're only looking at it as artificial because of that line of considering things natural and not? I mean, that's a separate conversation, but you do have to consider that as far as the species is concerned, looking abstractly from a biological perspective, the possibility exists that we are making ourselves weaker as a species as a result of keeping elements, stopping the natural process of selection for those particular factors in our society, and that we may be becoming genetically weaker as a result, as organisms, not as races. So, but the question of ethics comes in. Do you allow parents to get genetic tests to see if a particular, sperm and egg are going to cause something recessive, and let them make that decision, or at least tell them the percentage chance that their child might have a developmental disability? I'm literally talking about a system where I would not exist as a person with autism. Maybe I would be one of the people that got snipped out. So I think taking a step back and figuring out where the line is, because a big problem happens if you save the conversation for when it becomes pressing. because then we lack the perspective and the clarity to be able to discuss. It's like a relationship.
Mm.
If you sit down with a new partner and you figure out how you communicate, you figure out how that person needs to be apologized to when something's wrong. You figure out, what's some of their narrative and their parenting attachment style and where their pain points are in life, then you're getting to get that information while things are positive and to create a framework moving forward that benefits everyone. If you try to do that in the middle of having conflict, it can be very difficult to teach a person how you need to be apologized to when you already need an apology.
Yeah, well,
you know,
exactly.
because that invalidates you.
Yeah.
Because now here I am needing something and I have to give more
And
before I
I
even
don't
get back.
want to.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so it's important, I think, to have the conversation. We need to have the conversation of what happens if we're able to make human beings live forever. What do we do? Because that's going to create a whole bunch of problems, right? Let's
Yeah.
say we master the human genome and we figure out, nanotechnology to combat telomere shortening, or, maybe we, replace the brain with nanobots that perform the same function as neurons, and because of that, we can grow a clone of our own body and transplant the brain, and we get to keep going. If that happens, well, that changes things for overpopulation a bit, because that process is going to happen a whole heck of a lot faster. And will people unilaterally have access to that technology, or are we just talking about the rich and the famous and the people who can afford it? And what ethical considerations should we have with a person who's able to live forever?
And
You
do
know,
we want that? That's the other thing,
exactly, exactly.
critically thinking beings, do we really want to do that?
And if we have those conversations now, then maybe in a world where we start to move up on that and get confronted with it. Because look at what happened with AI,
Mm.
right? We got hit with language-based AI. We got this beta for Chat GPT. We're all jumping in. We got to 150, million people already just jumped onto it in the first 10 days. And everyone is learning in 5 minutes
Mm.
that some of the jobs that people are going to college for right now may not exist in 20 years as this technology improves. And if we'd have listened to the people who were trying to ask those questions when it started and started to have the conversation on a more important level, then maybe we'd be prepared for it.
Mm.
Are we prepared for a civilization where, you know, not all human beings have jobs? Are we prepared for a civilization where, you know, school is going to be about learning how to ask the right questions of AI so it understands our intent, and less focused on things like how to write a paper or how to format or how to write in cursive, or, you know, all of these things are all passing fancies of the moment, and what we think is important in one moment and the next moment can be unimportant. We used to be so worried about downloading songs, and yet the culture changed
Yeah.
to adapt to the phenomenon. If we would have been able to have more of those conversations at first, instead of just trying to hold on to, oh no, we're gonna sue everybody. We're gonna stop it. We're gonna file an injunction. You can fight all you want, but if a new idea takes over, it's gonna take over. And you can either change with it or fade away. And I think it's a lesson that we have to learn, because we have to have those hard conversations, whether or not a eugenic solution is the answer to that problem, or even if there is a problem.
Yeah.
I think it's important to be able to have the conversation, you
Right.
know, and at a certain point, especially if we've really screwed up as a people, like we really screwed up as human beings with the Holocaust, right?
Yeah.
That it's so bad that we can't even try and figure out if the brass number plate on this or that location where people died, if it's accurate or not, to be able to have it, we have to change it 6 times because we're so afraid of even having the conversation, because it's such a horrible topic and so many horrible things did happen, that at a certain point, whether or not the information is even correct is less important than just giving it the freaking space that it needs.
Yeah.
And if we get to that point because we haven't had those conversations, and then we're not allowed to talk about it culturally, we want to just move ourselves away from that topic entirely. we do an out of sight, out of mind thing. And we do that with impoverished countries. We do that with our homeless. We do that with anyone that we don't want to acknowledge exists. And failing to have those conversations always leads to trouble, in my opinion.
Definitely, and coming from South Africa, we had sanctions. And yet we're repeating those things because we didn't have the conversations. We did have the conversations when there was the right leader, but then that leader passed on, and now we don't know. How do we move forward? So how do we have these conversations? How do we create these spaces where I can have these conversations? What do you think?
I think that we have to start respecting and elevating the people who have the right message rather than picking a horse. And as ideas change, that needs to change too. That this social support paradigm that we have, this popularity contest, it all it ends up doing is we end up meeting our heroes and being disappointed. Because once you give a person enough attention, eventually they make a mistake.
If
Because
they're
people,
inauthentic, if they're not
yeah,
their true self, because I'm going to have to change to fit into this image that was created through maybe none of my intention, but that's what we create so easily.
well, but morality is so subjective too. Like there could be this person that I admire more than anything, but she's pouring that non-dairy creamer into her cup of coffee and, feeding her little pet sausage to her little toy Pomeranian while she's talking about really important stuff. Authenticity is a point of view.
But so
So
is morality.
exactly. And
Yeah,
I just think that, we should be more concerned about the idea and the message than the person. And in today's culture of egocentrism, I think the opposite is often the case.
I agree, and that's why I think ideas inspire impact. If we can talk about these ideas, they can inspire change.
And if we don't talk about them, then you get a whole bunch of people protesting their own government in Washington, D.C., which can be a pretty big spectacle.
Yeah.
So,
Well, in
you know,
England, if you stand up against anything, you seem to be going to jail. So,
well,
you know,
the problem is that once you have 100 people all standing there shouting, once one of them throws a brick, then the
yeah,
possibility that more people are going to throw a brick starts to get really high because
yeah,
people are, if they're brimming with energy, once a person, it's that shot heard around the world kind of thing.
yeah,
And once someone breaks that barrier, then starting the chain reaction can be very difficult. So do I am I happy about, journalists being shot with rubber bullets and all of that? No, not at all. That's horrific. The flip side is if you see a group of people and the psychology of a group of people could put them into a place where they could start rioting and looting and hurting one another, there's a tipping point. And where that tipping point is depends on, your society, your narrative, your government, all of that stuff. There's a whole set of factors that go into it. But at some point, the public good starts to trump the right to express in that particular moment.
yeah.
And
Once again, it's systems, though. So we're trying to change the system from within. It doesn't work. We have to
and
stop
that's
it.
because of the communication breakdown, and that's why we're trying to avoid it in the first place. If we can
Exactly.
talk openly about those ideas and get to a place of agreement before it degenerates into finger pointing and screaming and people throwing rocks at one another, then I would say that's a decent social goal to have.
Well, exactly. And in alchemy, it's all about finding that unconditional love, and portraying that, or expressing that within a conversation where it's like I bring love to the table. Your opinion, you know what I mean? It's unconditional. So just because you put that creamer in your coffee and maybe do that.
It's not about putting the creamer in your coffee. It's about what happens once you find out where the creamer comes from.
Exactly.
If I show you how horrible that whole thing is,
Mm.
and then you shrug your shoulders and say, ah, but I like my creamer in my coffee, then you've made a moral decision.
Yeah, but that's also now subjective. I can still love you, but I'm not going to hang out with you because it's not where I want to move towards. If this is not important to you, then
Depends on your definition of the word love. Sometimes
yes.
love is showing a person that you have boundaries and that they can't be present in your life if they don't choose to place value on the things that are important to you.
Not
Sometimes
because you're putting a
love,
condition on it, though. That I
some,
think is the difference. So, I can love you and not hang out with you because I choose not to, kind of thing.
well, but we also influence everyone through our peer groups. And if you really want a person to change their mind about something, the other perspective is that you have to be willing to be in their space.
Do we need to change people's minds, though? Can we present them with the information or the perspective and leave it
It,
up to them?
that depends on whether or not you place a value on critical thinking in a society.
Yes, and that's why you might not want to hang out in that environment, because if you see that it's not there, I can still respect you for who you are, maybe not for the decisions you make, but for who you are, but it's
Is
not my
that what's
vibe.
more important? I think I'm going to have a bone to pick with you. Is it better to be born good and to choose good through knowing nothing else, or is it better to be born evil and to choose good through great effort? Is it
I
our
don't know if there is
nature,
a good and evil.
or is it our decisions that dictate our value, our actions? Maybe I'm insecure and jealous of my partner,
Mm.
and when someone flirts with my partner, it puts me in a bad place. But maybe I choose to direct that energy at something positive because I've learned that that can be a toxic thing inside me. It's not, you know, I just don't like your decision, but I respect you as a person. I think
Yeah, yeah.
that decisions are the manifestation of who that person chooses to be as a person, and that is what you should look at, not at their nature, but what did they choose to do with it? How do they respond to failure? How do they respond to new information? And I think that that's a much more important rubric to, and personally, at least for me, is to look at what a person has done with that process rather than their nature. But maybe that's just me.
I agree. I agree. So how can I respect someone that I don't agree with, or whose processes I don't agree with? Because
By
yeah.
paying respect to the process and the experience by which they acquired the perspective.
Hmm.
You can follow someone's work to see how they got to their conclusion and validate that process without agreeing with their conclusion. As long as someone's authentic and wants to do good and wants to consider the consequences of their actions, even if they choose poorly, then if you examine the process by which they made their decision, then you can still respect them if you disagree with their decision. But it's like mens rea in law. It's about whether or not you know right from wrong and are choosing to do something anyway. And I think that that is more of a distinction than a person's nature or what decisions they make. It's how they make their decisions and do they try to make authentic decisions. Because I'll take a person full of failure with authenticity any day over someone else.
Yeah, same. And trudging through the self-awareness kind of um process is something to respect on its own. So when someone doesn't go there, it makes you think and go, you know,
Well, speaking to my own unique narrative, the sun is about to come up, and it's been fascinating having this conversation with you, and I hope that we get to do it again.
yes.
But I do have to, once that big burning ball of gas goes up into the sky, do all of the wonderful things that are associated with its ascension. So I think we've had a pretty interesting. We decided to leapfrog off of the teleportation conversation, which I found amusing personally. But I hope that it starts to spark that conversation, because if we can't, going back to your point of trust, if we can't trust that people are being authentic in their decisions, then what we're really surrounded by is a whole bunch of selfishness. And I think that trying to make those connections with people and give them that insight and try to give them that opportunity to choose differently, but also giving them the information so they can learn from their mistakes,
Yeah,
maybe a value we need a bit more of.
exactly. And I look forward to having more conversations with you, and maybe we can solve some of these issues
Sounds
somehow.
amazing.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Anshar. It is always amazing chatting to you.
And with you.
Thank you.